everyone. Thank you, Brother Shakara. It's a pleasure to be here, and I do have to say I kind of feel like I've arrived now because this is my first debut on gotkushTV. So I feel like somebody now because everybody else they're on it because you have plenty conversations with people and ones and things are going and I'm here, so I'm like I'm feeling special right now. So give thanks. Um, Yeah, I'm Jendayi. I am the co-chair of the African Emancipation Day Reparations March Committee, and I'm also a member of the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. And yeah, that's pretty much, I suppose, why I'm here today in relation to those two hats. But in terms of the theme or the title for today, I thought I would start with just looking at basic background and concepts so that we can go deeper into the analysis as we go on through into the evening, because I don't want to make any assumptions about what we may or may not know about these things without laying them out in some way, particularly around Black Lives Matter, reparations, and so on, and the concept of power. So that's me. And this is what I intend to do today in terms of looking at the genesis of Black Lives Matter and key elements of what is reparations, because we seem to have this fixation with a particular idea of what reparations means. So I'd like to explore that a little bit and look at, yeah, where there is synthesis and where there is perhaps differences in terms of how these things play out in our overstanding and how we organize ourselves as well. So I take a lot of information from what is given on these websites because I'm not into, and I don't really want to talk about an opinion as to what stuff is. I want to work with, first of all, what is being told to us. And this is the line that is being told to us from the Black Lives Matter United States website, that we are told that these three women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, are the founders of Black Lives Matter. And that this was, we're told this was in response to, in particular, the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murder and also the murder of Mike Brown around that time in 2014. So they say they're an ideological and political intervention in a world where lives are systematically, Black lives are targeted for demise. They want to raise the profile of Black humanity and our contribution to society and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. They say they are a Black liberation movement, but what they also say is that they want to create room, space, and leadership, mostly for Black heterosexual cisgender men, that they want to create a leadership that is not about leaving women, queer, and transgender people and others either out of the movement or in the background to move the work forward with little or no recognition. So they say as a network, they have always recognized the need to center the leadership of women and queer and trans people. So I think what we're seeing there is that we're not just talking about race at this point. We're talking about Black Lives Matter, but we are not just talking about race. We're talking about gender identity and we're talking about sexual identity as two other key elements of what Black Lives Matter in the US are about. The founder says, in order to truly understand how devastating and widespread this type of violence is in Black America, we must view this epidemic through the lens of race, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So it's very much an intersectional approach, but maybe not intersectional in the way that Kimberly Crenshaw really conceptualized it in terms of power dynamics between these different, what they call under equalities law in England or in the UK, protected characteristics. But maybe I'll say more about that later. So she goes on, Patrice Cullors goes on to say, in talking about organizations and movements in the US, the Panthers, the National Action Network, the National Advancement of the Association of Colored People, she talks about them in one of her videos on the website and says that they never spoke to her interests. She says, I did not feel that they were talking to my generation, and so BLM, our global network, becomes that institution for the younger generation, a younger group of Black folks looking at contemporary issues like criminalization and taking it on, looking at law enforcement violence and taking it on. So where I see Black Lives Matter going is to build chapters to have that local power, building leadership around the globe. Our work is part of a long legacy of some of those organizations that I just mentioned. So this is Patrice Cullors talking about the future of BLM on one of the videos on the website, Black Lives Matter. Not to be confused with, but associated with the movement for Black Lives, which is a separate website, but is connected. This is the primary, if you like, umbrella organization, which they say is a coalition of over 60 organizations, and they fundraise and distribute to all of them, including Black Lives Matter. So the movement for Black Lives is an association of Black Lives Matter and has a separate website and a separate set of things that we'll go on to see. So they seek to reach millions, mobilize hundreds of thousands, and organize so that Black political power is a force to able to influence national and local agendas in the direction of our shared vision for Black lives. That was formed in 2014, as it says here, as a space for Black organizations across the country to debate, discuss the current political conditions, develop shared assessments of what political interventions were necessary in order to achieve key policy, cultural, and political wins, convene organizational leadership in order to debate and co-create a shared movement-wide strategy. So it's a coalition because they say under the fundamental idea that we can achieve more together than we can separately. So who supports Movement for Black Lives? So I've left these links in because people can, you know, when they go on the website, they can check them out themselves. So organizations such as the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, okay, and the National Council of Jewish Women have shown their support for the movement of Black Lives by issuing public statements following the movement's controversial publication of its platform. So the movement for Black Lives has similarities in terms of calling for criminal justice reform and end of police brutality. In one statement, Nancy Kaufman of the National Council of Jewish Women states that the National Council of Jewish Women affirms that Black Lives Matter, including Jews of color, who are a vital part of both the Jewish and our National Council for Jewish Women community. We recognize that Black and Jewish communities are inextricably linked and our struggles for social justice are connected. So the question that's coming to my head at this stage is that that is a broad church of support. It's a broad church of support by the same people who have historically oppressed people of African heritage and are now coming around this idea of Black Lives Matter. Why is that? And that's something for us to think about. So the Movement for Black Lives has a policy platform that's in many ways shared with Black Lives Matter. What they call for is an end to war on Black communities. So they're talking about reallocating funds at a federal and state level and looking at different models of policing and ending the war and incarceration of long-term of our people. Okay, they're also looking at reparations as a platform. They recognize past and continuing harms. They recognize that there's a responsibility on corporations that have, like we say here, living and benefiting from unjust enrichment as a result of the harm that they have inflicted on Black people, from colonialism to slavery through to food and housing redlining, mass incarceration, and surveillance. So these are the headlines of their policy platform for you to check out for yourself. It continues. They also are looking at economic justice. So they're looking for African Black lives in America to ensure that Black communities have collective ownership and, if you like, economic inclusion and equality in whatever way, shape or form. And community control. They demand a world where those most impacted in our communities control the laws, institutions and policies that are meant to serve us. So there's something there around self-policing, not necessarily self-governance, but self-policing and policies that are meant to serve us, from our schools to our local budgets, economies, police departments, and our land in America, whilst recognizing that the rights and histories of our indigenous family must also be respected. They go on to say they want political power. They demand an independent Black political power and Black self-determination in all areas of society in the US, okay? And they want the society they live in to respect protesters. They demand the rights of protesters be respected and that there is no abuse of powers in that respect. So we've got this movement that comes into heavy focus, some would say formation, around 2013, 2014, that has gone global, okay? And their vision for going global is in that respect being realized. But we have to ask ourselves, how were they managing to do that? And people often say, follow the money and you will find the power source. You will find who really is in control of the narrative and the direction of travel of the movement. So Politico, well respected, quote unquote, entity in the US, reported in 2015 that the Democracy Alliance, okay, met with leaders who were endorsing Black Lives Matter. They, according to Politico, the donor coalition named Solidaire focused on movement building, and that was led by a Texan oil fortune heir called Leah Hunt Hendricks, who is also a member of Democracy Alliance. And she had donated more than $200,000 to the Black Lives Matter movement by 2015. Now, in 2016, the Ford Foundation announced its plans to fund movement for Black lives in a 6-year investment plan, and future partnering up with others to found the Black-led Movement Fund, okay? So we have a situation where we have a lot of mainstream corporate, very powerful backers of movement for Black lives and Black Lives Matter. The sum donated by the Ford Foundation and the other donors to Movement for Black Lives was reported as $100 million by the Washington Times in 2016. Another donation of $33 million to Movement for Black Lives was reportedly issued by the Open Society Foundations. So influencewatch.org tells us liberal funders such as George Soros, and I've already mentioned Democracy Alliance, have given millions of dollars to groups associated with the movement, which has in total raked in over 133 million. Why is this? How is this? Just to put that into perspective, the African Emancipation Day Reparations March this year through GoFundMe have managed to raise something like £567. So there's something going on here. This, I'm hoping, should be raising alarm bells, should be getting us to question what is really behind and who is really behind these movements. Is it simply a case that these three women who were friends, maybe just, you know, on the sofa one day decided that they're going to start this thing and put a hashtag in front of it and just put it out there? I think not. And we need to be cognizant of history and how things form, because it tells us potentially where things are going to be going and in whose interests. So that was the US story. I just want to park that there for a minute, because we've talked about policy platforms, we've talked about funding sources, and as they say, when America sneezes, the UK catches a cold, and it did catch a cold, and Black Lives Matter UK was formed some years later, around 2018 mark, 2017, 2018. So their website is blacklivesmatter.uk. And when I went on there, the first thing I noted was a disclaimer right at the homepage, which said, "We are not affiliated to the political activist coalition using a Twitter at UK BLM or Instagram BLM UK. We do not have a GoFundMe page, they do. UK BLM Coalition do not have an official website to direct you to. For more information on Black Lives Matter protests, you need to contact the above directly or other BLM groups to preferred areas." So there's very much a question around who then is Black Lives Matter in the UK. Because you've got a website calling yourselves Black Lives Matter, but they're saying that they're not them, they are them. So who is the other they? They say they're not affiliated with either Black Lives Matter USA, nor the political arm of Black Lives Matter Activist Coalitions UK associated and affiliated with the USA. This particular website, blacklivesmatter.uk, has got pictures of various contributors. They're called contributors, not founders. The other Black Lives Matter that they're talking about is the one that's in the press, who've attracted 1.1 million in funds via GoFundMe, whom people are asking for more transparency around, because there's only one person that's been identified, not necessarily proven, but been identified as being the founders of that particular aspect. So they say they stand, Black Lives Matter UK, in solidarity with the common people demanding racial equality, social and criminal justice, basic human rights, operating as non-partisan, not a member or connected to with a group or political party, non-violence, unifying arm of the Black Lives Matter movement in Britain, United Kingdom. Their policy platform is, really they don't have one. Black Lives Matter UK, they talk about black votes. They have a section on Windrush, which is really just telling the stories of those who have been experiencing that particular harm through the Windrush scandal. And they talk about the so-called slave trade in terms of the debt that we as taxpayers finished paying off in 2015, for which there are various petitions and outrages about. So they don't really have a policy platform. They just, as they say, provide a voice in public or in private to ordinary people, colours and ethnicities who believe Black Lives Matter and who may not necessarily be affiliated to any political Black Lives Matter activist coalition group or any other political group. They say they operate as an inclusive, non-partisan, non-violent unifying arm. They want to break down the walls of silence that uphold and sustain racism in society and racial injustices. And what they tend to do quite a bit on that website is breaking white silence and having white people talking about racism, basically. So what they say on Facebook, I think I've covered this already. They're also saying in Black Lives Matter UK that all forms of oppression are interrelated. You cannot be for Black lives if you do not emphatically support the cause for Black queer lives, Black trans lives, and lives of Black women, and so on. So they say, and not exhaustively, that they stand with these Black communities, LGBTQIA+, women and non-binary people, disabled people, migrant asylum seeking, Muslim community, sex working community, working class community, intergenerational communities, HIV+ community, fat and plus size community, and so on. So from my perspective, what I'm seeing is a lot of corporate backing. I'm seeing a lot of mainstream backing. I'm seeing a lot of media prominence. There is a reason why the Premiership, who couldn't kick racism out of football, are putting Black Lives Matter on the shirts of their players for 12 matches and taking a knee at the beginning and putting Black Lives Matter on their advertising banners around the pitch. That's massive. There's a reason why big charities, Amazon and others, are wanting to support this. So there's a lot of corporate support. There's a lot of media prominence. There's a hell of a lot of financial support. Why is this? There's an international appeal, okay, for a slogan and for a movement. There is a drive within this movement for what they call non-cis male gendered leadership of a movement. This is what I'm seeing in the UK and in the US. And the whole communication in terms of how they put themselves forward, it's pretty much what you would call the language of diversity and inclusion. So it's very much couched in mainstream popular language. Black Lives Matter is something that they want to happen. They want to see Black Lives Mattering. They're not necessarily wanting to see, particularly in the UK, the emergence of Black power structures that speak to self-determination and self-governance. And any reference to self-determination is couched in a civil rights context. So it's about the reforms in the places that they are living, at that time. The Black lives in that country, in the US, in the UK. They are calling for reforms, mainly connected to the impact of state brutality, particularly police brutality, the criminal justice system, and eradicating poverty, okay? Equality and inclusion, as I said, is their goal, and political reform, more engagement with the voting process, but also establishment of political power to achieve more civil rights. So the self-determination aspect is about the rights of a citizen, not necessarily beyond that, beyond the place that they are. So they talk about Black liberation as opposed to any form of liberation. So we've got this term which is understood in the US and the UK very differently. So Black in the US is much wider than African heritage communities, much wider than the UK, who talks about Black meaning African and African Caribbean communities. So how does this link to reparations? Well, reparations means to repair harm, make amends for injury done, put right that which has been wronged, and to restore to a good condition that which has been damaged. And we see that Black Lives Matter UK and US are very much looking at that in the context of them being citizens in their land, okay? And I think that's important because when we come to look at things like power and Pan-Africanism, we see that we have to take those concepts much, much further. So what they're concerned with is really reform and equality, justice, inclusion in the 10 areas of people activity, 9 of them defined by Neely Fuller, and the 10th, which is health, added by Mama Frances Cress Welsing. So Black Lives Matter want reform and better services, better treatment amongst many areas of people activity, but not all of them. There's not much reference to religion and war and sex and relationship. Well, actually there is, but there are some elements of people activity that they haven't talked about at all, particularly in relation to entertainment and war, from my observations and little research. What they haven't talked about is the totality of the harm, the damage that we as African heritage people have experienced historically and currently. So we can talk about these 10 areas of people activity as being the ones that need fixing, that need repair. But does it go far enough? And to answer that question, I think we need to then look at, well, what has been lost? What has been impacted? Is it just those 10 areas or is it more? So I'm suggesting that in terms of reparations, what we're looking at as a Pan-African movement and our contribution to the international social movement for African reparations is not just recognizing the need for change and reform and inclusion in those areas of people activity. We are talking about things that have been lost, that don't fit in. So your identity, which links you to a landmass, your identity, which links you to language and languages, your identity that signposts you, so you know what your spiritual norms are, you know what your practices are, you know what your customs are within your culture. We have also lost our names. These things cannot be fixed and cannot be reclaimed, cannot be repaired under a civil rights agenda. We have a total attack on us in terms of mind, body, and spirit as African heritage people. So we have to really have a deep understanding that just to have better policing, just to have better healthcare, just to have more teachers or more judges that look like you and I, cannot be the totality of the answer around repair. So what I would say to you is that Black Lives Matter has a social reformist agenda, not necessarily an African liberation agenda, because the other thing that we're not seeing is any reference to Africa. So if we're going to look at holistic reparations, then we need to understand the 5 principles under international law, which give us a right to a remedy. And these are the first 3: restitution. And that is about restoring us, the victims of the harm, to original situation before the gross violations took place. So that is not just about giving back the Benny and bronze that you have, your tea from us, and having at your museum, right? It's about our repatriation and our rematriation, about other things that need to be restored and returned, okay? So when we talk about holistic reparations as a Stop the Mangamese campaign and a March committee, this is what we're talking about. So it goes beyond a civil reformist agenda, because we're now talking about our right to Africa, and we're now talking about a need for our recognition under international law as Africans as part of our restitution. The rehabilitation is about tackling the menticide that has afflicted our community, the rise in Afrophobia that we have, that has us working against ourselves, have us working against our own interests, having us sabotaging our own interests, because for a lot of us, the goal has been to ultimately become more comfortable under the system of white supremacy. So rehabilitation should include medical and psychological care, as well as legal and social services. And compensation should be provided for any economically accessible damage. So you may want to try, but I would not put a price on the life of my ancestors. I would not put a price on the loss of my identity, my language, my customs, my norms. I would not put a price on the amount of work that we have done to develop and support the system of white supremacy, not only in the global north, but all over the world for centuries. There's a lot that we have lost in terms of our mind, body, and spirit that simply you cannot put a price on, okay? So the fourth principle under international law talks about satisfaction. So what is it we need to have in place that we are satisfied that a process of reparatory justice has been reached, has gone to a conclusion where we feel that we are there now? So it talks here, points A to F, about a range of measures, okay? But I want to draw attention to point B, which is verification of facts and full and public disclosure of truth, because the Stop the Maangamizi campaign has been calling for this very process through a commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice into the legacies of enslavement for the past 6 years. That is why we have, since 2015, marched to Downing Street to deliver the petition charging the British state with genocide and ecocide, and calling for, within that petition on change.org, a commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice, and also mentioning within that petition our own organizing and justice framework that we as African people need to establish around the world, which we call Ubuntu Gotla, which is a People's International Tribunal for Global Justice. So there are two processes, one that involves perpetrators, one that's self-determining, Ubuntu Gotla, for us and by us. So there are several measures under satisfaction. Some have more merit and some requiring wider discussion, I feel. This issue of an apology is one that almost is as spoken about as much as the compensation one, as if those are the only two elements that matter. And this is why we need to be able to frame our reparatory justice goal according to what we have lost historically, not just in the here and now, in terms of where we are now, how we are defined now, okay, and where our children are likely to be born and growing, and grandchildren in the future. So there needs to be a wider lens, I would suggest, which relates to these 5 principles under international law, for us to really grasp what it is we're trying to achieve through the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, and for others who are also involved in the international social movement for African reparations. So the 5th one is guarantees of non-repetition. And I would suggest, in looking at this 5th principle of guarantees of non-repetition, we see that we have some way to go, and actually financial compensation just won't cut it. Because how are we going to ensure that this never happens to us again? Is having better housing, having better healthcare, access to healthcare, having more dark-skinned people in hospitals and schools and magistrates' courts, are these things going to guarantee a non-repetition of the harm that has meted out to us, not just historically, but currently? Okay, so if not, what is it we need to have in place? So under international law, there's suggestions again, A to H, things like effective civilian control of military and security forces, okay, independence of the judiciary, okay, and a host of other things, reviewing and reforming laws, contributing to or allowing gross violations. Ultimately, you can't tackle these things if you're still operating as different people who do not know themselves, who are not working together, who are Black British and are comfortable with that, who are African Caribbean, more leaning to the Caribbean and are comfortable with that. That's actually, you know, a place that we were dropped off to, and we have actually forgotten that in the most part. You know, that there's a degree of comfort that we have, which I think stops us looking at the bigger picture in terms of where we need to go, and to actually recognize and accept that reparations is about restoration of nation. It may start with the reforms, which are expressed in the 10 areas of people activity, and maybe within other policy platforms and social agendas, but it cannot stop there. It cannot stop there. If we have lost our right to Africa, then civil reform can't be the totality of our answer. And so what we're not seeing with Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives in the US or the UK is any specific reference or relationship to Africa. There is no recognition that we are a people who have historically, or very little recognition, who have lost all these things that I have expressed and need to reclaim them in order to be whole again. There's no structure or organizing for Pan-African power. I, as a citizen of the UK, but of African heritage, should have a right to Africa and should be recognized as an African. Who is doing that? Who on the continent, in terms of leadership and governance, is recognizing my status as an African? They're not. So there is a problem if we think that reform at a social level and civil level is going to create power for us, because power lies in the relationship you have to your land collectively and your heritage. So if we are turning away from our landmass, if we're not recognizing ourselves and fighting for ourselves to be global African citizens, born away from home, in exile, then we stand to repeat the things of the past, because we have not done anything to collectively establish our right to Africa, be recognized as Africans, and organizing ourselves in the diaspora as an African who relates to their landmass and their territory of Africa. There is no recognition and no mention of the word genocide in terms of Raphael Lemkin's 1948 definition, which I haven't put up here, but it's something that people can look at. So we're not just talking about police brutality. We're not just talking about the criminal justice system. The Maangamizi, as we call it, the African Holocaust, has a plethora of ways that it manifests, and it's way beyond police brutality, way beyond the criminal justice system. And so those are two of the ways that genocide is inflicted on our people in modern times. But there are several others that relate to us, whether you talk about biological warfare, whether you're talking about land grabs, whether you're talking about the school to prison pipeline, there are several manifestations of the Maangamizi that the Black Lives Matter US and UK agenda are not recognizing and are not seeking to deal with. The Stop the Maangamizi campaign seeks to bring that holistic understanding of what actually we're up against. So,
sorry, Sister Jendayi. I think I accidentally muted you. I apologize.
okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Was it just a couple of seconds?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, there was some background noise and I clicked the wrong one. I apologize.
Okay, no problem. So there's no full recognition of the extent to how Black lives, quote unquote, experience genocide systemically, and not just in the US, not just in the UK, all over the world. You know, that Black Lives Matter talks about a worldwide movement, but it's a worldwide movement confined to what they see as being the issue in terms of police brutality, police reform. You know, talk about divesting and defunding police and things like this as being solutions to their issues. Oh, what have I got now? Oh, I've stopped. I don't know why I've stopped. Let me just escape. I think I've got a freeze. Oh, here we go. So what we're not seeing is a strong policy platform for Black Lives Matter in the UK. We're not seeing any reference to nation building or nationhood. It's about Black Lives Mattering, which for me has a bit of a tinge of am I not a man and a brother kind of feel to it, which is the kind of slogan that the Quakers came up in their abolitionist movement in the 19th century. And so we need to I think critically look at some of these things. This is just a flagging up really for us to not just diss it because it's something that we haven't read about, but we got to understand what it is and what's missing from it from a Pan-African perspective, from an African-centered perspective. So there's no vision of reparations that go beyond civil rights. When we're talking about our right to Africa, they're talking about their right not to be beaten by police and things like this. So there's no transparency either. Who are Black Lives Matter UK? Who are the people that are really funding these people? And, you know, so there's no transparency about their political and philanthropic affiliations. You don't get that information from their website. You have to search outside of that to know where their money is coming from. Right, I think this is lagging again. It may just hopefully move on. I'm almost done, but I'm not sure why my slides are not moving on. Just bear with me. It's not even escaping. I really don't know what that's about. Ooh, right, let me try this. Where was I now? So I've talked about what we're not seeing. And so we have to go beyond mattering. When we talk about our lives mattering, we have to talk about the concept of power, which has been defined by several people, including Neely Fuller. We have to talk about beyond mattering because reparations is beyond Black lives mattering in a civil context. It must extend to notions and moves towards African liberation by Africans at home and abroad. For me, Pan-Africa, the social, political, economic and cultural unification of Africa. It's Africa led by Africans in the interest of Africans, wherever Africans find themselves on the continent and in the diaspora. And this includes the recognition and inclusion of Africans born away from home, like ourselves in whatever circumstances. So reparations must work towards a new vision of a restored nation that we within the Global African People's Parliament, within the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, refer to as Ma'atubuntuman. So some of these things I believe will be expanded upon by my brothers and sisters later on today. So this is just a blanket foundation really, exploring Black Lives Matter US and UK, looking how it relates and doesn't relate to the fuller picture of reparations and African liberation and Pan-Africanism. So they are connected. Power and empowerment of our people. We can't do much, get very far, achieve much without contesting for power, without organizing ourselves for power. And I'm sure the Gotkush event that includes Sister Esther and Sister Affion will go extensively into that. So this Venn diagram about repair, liberate, and power, they're all intrinsically linked. And that's the stage where we need to get to at an organizational level, but also at a conscious levels in our head in terms of the work that we need to do to establish that. So I think I'm gonna leave it there and stop screen sharing. I'm done. Thank you.